Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ed Rosenberg. I'm in the chemistry department, and it is a privilege and an honor to welcome Professor Roald Hoffman from Cornell University for tonight's President Lecture Series. As you all know, the President Lecture Series has been going for 25 years or more and has been free to the public. As time has gone by, things have become more expensive, and tonight you have the opportunity to donate to the fund. After the lecture, there'll be a book signing. And at that time, you'll have the opportunity to put some cash in an envelope for him for the series. Tonight's lecture is being co-sponsored by the Department of Chemistry and by the Division of Biological Sciences. I first met Roald Hoffman in the classroom in 1966 as a beginning graduate student. Professor Hoffman had just joined the faculty at Cornell University, and he gave a series of lectures on the conservation of orbital symmetry, a theoretical model that allowed organic chemists to predict the course of a large class of thermal and photochemical reactions. Chemical theory often deepens our understanding or rationalizes experimental data, but it is rare when you can take a theoretical construct into the laboratory and actually design syntheses and new molecules using them, such as the theory that he developed called conservation of orbital symmetry. 50 years later, I still remember a statement that he made, and I hope I get it right. And he said that mathematics is a crutch for explaining things we really don't understand. This statement belies a healthy skepticism about chemical theory, which relies on orbitals that are generated from the simple hydrogen atom. He received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1981 for this crutch. Professor Hoffman described himself as an applied theoretical chemist, and in his 50-plus years of research, he has applied theory to a significant portion of the periodic table of the elements. Quite remarkable. In the 70s and 80s, he turned his attention from organic chemistry to inorganic and organometallic chemistry, and in particular, metal cluster chemistry, an area of research that I was engaged in for, well, a long time. His paper in 1979 in the Journal of the American Chemical Society provided kind of a handbook for me on how to design the research that I was doing at the time. Since then, Professor Hoffman has continued to apply chemical theory to increasingly complex systems. Those of you who attended this afternoon's lecture can really appreciate how beautifully he can make the profound simple. He published this in most of his work, 500-plus publications. He always alludes to the intrinsic beauty of molecular architectures, and in fact published a series of papers entitled Molecular Beauty. Having read those papers, they were inspiring to me right through my formative years as a research scientist. Professor Hoffman's contributions to science are just part of the story. He has been an incredibly creative scholar in the humanities as well. He's published 5 books of poetry, written 3 plays, one of which has been translated into 7 languages, performed in Europe and Asia, as well as in the United States. He served as host of a TV series entitled The World of Chemistry, and has been a great communicator of the chemical enterprise to the public. His essays in The American Scientist and his 2 published nonfiction books have helped to define the underlying intellectual tension beneath the surface of chemistry and the relationship between science and religion. Professor Hoffman has received worldwide recognition for his scholarship and literary contributions. He holds 29 honorary degrees from universities around the world. In addition to the Nobel Prize, he has received the National Medal of Science and 26 other awards for his chemical research. And to my knowledge, is the only chemist who has been honored by the American Chemical Society for both contributions in organic and inorganic chemistry. He was born Roald Safran in Zalechev, Poland. I'm sure that's not the right pronunciation. In 1937, he was named Roald after the famous explorer Roald Amundsen. He is a Holocaust survivor and lost much of his family in the Nazi occupation. He arrived in the United States in 1949 at age 11. He attended Peter Stuyvesant High School in Manhattan, New York, obtained a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Columbia University, summa cum laude, and a PhD from Harvard in chemical physics with William Lipscomb, working on the molecular orbital theory of boron hydrides. After 3 years at Harvard under a special fellowship, he joined the faculty at Cornell and has been there ever since. Since 1996, he is the Frank H.T. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters, now Emeritus, and Professor of Chemistry Emeritus. He has been married to Ava Borgeson since 1960, and they have 2 children. Finally, I just wanted to add that Professor Hoffman has opted to teach freshman chemistry at Cornell for most of his teaching career. In fact, our own Jack Numberg in the Division of Biological Sciences had him for freshman chemistry and still sings the praises of his lectures. Those of us who have done this know how challenging and often frustrating it can be. And his choosing to do this represents a testimony to the beauty of his soul as well as the beauty of his creative work. So without that, Professor Hoffman, tell us your story.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the introduction. The teaching is important, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Let me just say that I don't like any photographs taken during the lecture. That includes cell phones. Just after the lecture, I'll jump up and down for you, whatever you do you want, but it's distracting, as you see from the slides. So, one culture, the stresses on commonalities, and that evokes something in people of a certain age at least, and that is C.P. Snow's lecture and writing on the 2 cultures. That was a long time ago. He postulated a rift between scientists and humanists, scientists and technologists on one hand, and humanists and artists on the other. The worldviews of these groups clashed with each other, shaped as they were by mutual ignorance. The scientists did not care about literature, the great wellsprings of our civilization, and the humanists did not know the second law of thermodynamics or the integral calculus, equally great intellectual achievements. The 2 cultures were unable to communicate. C.P. Snow was very well qualified to speak of these 2 worlds. He was, first of all, a scientist, a spectroscopist, and I found myself recently with some surprise quoting a paper of his on an electronic spectrum of a molecule. And he became a university administrator during the Second World War, and a novelist, the author of an 11-volume series of novels, a meticulous and psychologically perceptive, if somewhat turgid, study of English private and intellectual life. If you ever want to introduce someone to what being at a high table at Cambridge or Oxford is, the Snow novels remain the best introduction. Snow's lecture and essay on the 2 cultures struck a resonance. The breach between the cultures seemed real across the world, and it was time someone had said it, and that phrase entered our consciousness. Now, how do we fare 60 years on? Certainly, some of Snow's points are as valid today as they were in his time. The scientific illiteracy of the people in the arts persists, if anything, proportionately greater in a world of still accelerating technology. And scientists make little effort to tell their friends and colleagues of what they really are doing. They lapse too easily into paeans to technological achievement instead of trying to communicate the essences of what they do. That gulf of incomprehension that Snow wrote of may have been broadened in these years by the psychological divisiveness that ensues from the growing affluence of scientific research. Let me be specific and talk about my university, operating with a nearly $2 billion budget a year. $400 million comes in sponsored research from the federal government mainly, some in part from the state. Of that 400 million, 385 million is for science and technology, including the medical school, and 10 million is for the social sciences, and about 1 million, a lot is scattered, about 1 million is for the humanities and the arts. This is not MIT, this is Cornell. Money corrupts absolutely. I'm not talking about real corruption, I'm talking about a corruption of the spirit. Do we want our students educated in that ratio? Obviously not. But in so many ways, Snow was wrong. He overestimated the innate basic liberalism of scientists. He was thinking in socialist terms at the time, but the epidemic of student troubles that followed shortly upon when he spoke polarized academics around the world, and the scientists came out pretty conservative in that, as they come out in often on environmentalist issues in our time. Snow's attribution of scientific illiteracy to the humanists misjudged the prevalent ignorance in science about other fields of science. And that sometimes I think that a physicist's notion of what goes on in chemistry borders on the unreal. There are problems, and the other way around as well. But I don't want to fight with Snow because he's not here to debate with me. It's his shade. So what I'm going to do is to present to you, I'm going to go in a different direction, and my inclination is to tell stories. And it's good that Ed mentioned that at the beginning. I tell little stories, and I'm going to tell you 3.5 or so stories that come from areas that are important to me, from science and poetry and then the visual arts and ceramics, and if I have a chance. And I will tell you these stories in some detail, but I'm not going to tell you what you should see in them, what I see in them even. I'm just going to tell you the stories. But at the end, I will stop after I tell you these, and I will tell you what I see that is common and that is different in those 3 stories. So let me begin with the science one. Let's see. So this is an old story. Begins in 1973 or so. I walk into the library to look at the latest issues of the journal. Now, obviously, that dates it to 1973. No one would do that today. Our libraries have disappeared, or at least parts of them, that had the journals in them. And we can talk about it. I've set up the equivalent on the web of the library for myself. But I walk into the issue of the journal, and there I see an article in which it says tris ethylene nickel 0. Now, it's just as well that you can't read this, because it begins, there is a little historical note. In 1872, Zeiss had discovered the first transition metal complex containing complex ethylene. Very quickly it lapses into jargon. Jargon is designed for good reasons, to enhance communication among practitioners in a field. It serves, of course, to keep other people out. So it is difficult, but it doesn't really matter. But you see there a picture. Let me tell you what it's about. So there's an ethylene molecule. Ethylene is an interesting molecule in a number of ways. C2H4, 6 atoms lying in a plane. And these people have made a compound which 3 such ethylenes, as indicated by the formula, are attached to a nickel atom. Now, the interesting thing in the ethylene, or why this is important in some way, so it's interesting that the one set of compounds which have come to the fore in the last 70 years and have overtaken the classical chemicals in terms of the volume of their production, inversely proportional to their cost, are the synthetic polymers which are built on ethylene. And the polymer of ethylene that we all know is polyethylene, which comes to us in a number of different forms that we use every day, and it would be hard to, it's here in this bottle. Surrounding the water. So there is interest in ethylene for those reasons. Now, usually when a molecule is made, you can determine its structure, sometimes by methods in the laboratory of one kind or another, sometimes by a technique called X-ray crystallography. But in order to apply that technique, you need for the molecule to form crystals. And people have found very good ways to form crystals. This molecule refused to crystallize. It remained a nice yellow oil, no matter what they did to it. And so they could not get its structure. So what could be its structure? Here are 2 possibilities: the nickel in the center and 3 ethylenes lying down, or 3 ethylenes standing up like soldiers. Something else is going on here, which is going on in all chemistry papers. Chemistry papers contain much more graphical material than most other papers in science. Up to 40% of the page is taken by graphical structures in many papers. Those structures, though they're better today because they're produced by computer-enhanced programs, those structures are very interesting objects to the artistic community, because what you have here is 3-dimensional representations. But there's nothing there to help you see this in 3 dimensions unless you know that you should look at it in a different way. There is no plane, there is no background to give you a perspective, there is no perspective in this really at all. That those ethylenes in back should be smaller in a perspective drawing, but they're not in this picture. So what we have here is a very interesting thing. What we have is a community of people, chemists, to whom it is a matter of life or death sometimes to portray a molecule in detail, and sometimes it is a question that a molecule has certain quality and its mirror image might be toxic in some way. So you have this community of people to whom it is a matter of life or death to communicate information in 3 dimensions, but they're not talented at doing so. That's a definition of life. We're always put to tasks that we cannot do. So how do they do it? That's part of an interesting story, but that's not this lecture. What happened next was, I saw this paper in a library. It was a group in Germany, in Mülheim. I turned to a coworker, Notke Rösch, who was coincidentally German on a postdoc, and I asked him, Notker, can we do some calculations on this? I'm a theoretical chemist. We solve equations approximately to tell us the motion of electrons in a molecule. Can we determine the difference in energy? Can we determine which one is favored? Notker went away. We talked over 3 or 4 months. We produced a calculation which favored the 3 ethylenes lying down, as you see at left. And we came up also with a rationale that somehow the electrons were moving in a more favorable manner in that structure. We wrote it up in a paper which eventually got published in another journal, in Organic Chemistry. Here you can see the 2 little drawings at left. Again, it's not important, but that paper did not appear till September 74. The initial paper we saw was in the fall of 73. We submitted this, I don't know when, June 74, and then or 75, and eventually it got published. But before it was published, I sent a preprint. At that time, it was a physical copy made with a copying machine. Today, of course, it would be a PDF. And I sent it to, who did I send it? I used it as a form of extended correspondence. If someone wrote to me a letter about science, and it was interesting, when I answered them, I said, hey, here's a paper that I've been working on, something I've done lately. I certainly sent the paper to the German people who made the molecule. That made sense. But aside from that, I used the paper as a form of extended correspondence, bypassing the journal before it was ever accepted for publication and published. And in that mode, there wrote to me Michael Green from Bristol, and he said, I sent him the paper, and that was before this was published. It was in July, and he answered by return mail, we have made trisethylene platinum, and it does crystallize. And he didn't need to say more, because he knew that I knew, and he knew that I knew that he knew the periodic table, and platinum, though much more expensive and under nickel, and though very different from nickel, has similar properties as far as the arrangement of atoms around it. So within 2 weeks, his collaborator, Judith Howard, a great crystallographer, did the structure of this. This is the paper that they eventually published, and there you see the 3 ethylenes lying down. So this is the story. It involves Mülheim, Ithaca, and Bristol, England. And it involves a journal and a preprint, a copy of the paper, and the scientific literature. That's the end of my first story. Now let's read a poem. Do I risk reading this in German? My version of German is a geopolitically conditioned conglomerate of Yiddish, Swiss German, and Swedish. Archaischer Torso Apollos. Poem is by Rainer Maria Rilke. I will read it in German. You can read the translation if you don't know German at right, by Robert Bly. Wir kannten nicht sein unerhörtes Haupt, darin die Augenäpfel reiften, aber sein Torso glüht noch wie ein Kandelaber, in dem sein Schauen nur zurückgeschraubt sich hält und glänzt. Sonst könnte nicht der Buch der Brust dich blenden, und im leisen Drehen der Lenden könnte nicht ein Lächeln gehen zu jener Mitte, die die Zeugung trug. Sonst stünde dieser Stein entstellt und kurz unter den Schultern in durchsichtigem Sturz und flimmerte nicht so wie Raubtierfelle und breche nicht aus allen seinen Rändern aus wie ein Stern. Da ist keine Stelle, die dich nicht sieht. Du musst dein Leben ändern. This poem was written in a period when Rilke was down and out in Paris in the first decade of the 20th century. And if you want a good antidote to romantic novels by Hemingway and Miller about how nice it was to be down and out in Paris, you can read Rilke's only novel, The Notebooks of Malte Laurids-Brigge. But he is a secretary to Rodin, so he's very interested in sculpture. He's very interested in classical sculpture. And he writes about this. It's about, of course, what is it about? It's easy in some way. It's about something that we have all seen. A Greek statue, a Roman copy of a Greek statue, which through the vicissitudes of time has lost its extremities, and all that is left is the torso of Apollo. And he describes that, and the important, what comes through from this poem, what he tells us that is true, is that by the act of these being mutilated, because we naturally reconstruct what is missing in the extremities, this statue gains power over us. And the way that the light falls on it is so beautifully described. I don't know in what way Rilke's life was changed by this. The you here could be, as in English, addressed to himself, or it could be to you out there, the reader. Either way, it's clear that the impact is very strong. This is what a poem can do. Here is a local poem by Joanna Klink, Aubade. Caravans of wind, a cast-over starlessness, is the brunt of taking leave mine? Whole nights vanishing again into the crass dailiness of morning, ends of summer, ends of towns, you pull back into the truce you've made with yourself. 4 shades of white, never time for the precision in limbs, languor, the slower charge where your eyes release into mine to feel the slight weight and shift, ground in spring and its dark pressure of flowers. Instead, the sudden fever mark on my cheek, a sharp heat that flies from your palm as you press it for a second where my heart under skin is. Hive in ivory is distraction. Is it the rampant property of night we share and see at the gravesides every day as we are talking with someone who is just sitting or just staring out? Water in the color of daylight. Whose are you in that intense and separate ache, if not mine? So it doesn't need the title Aubade to signal to us that it is a poem of leave-taking, of a sadness and of love. And it's in mourning, which is right for an Aubade. There are remarkable things in this poem going on. There are mysteries. There are things which we cannot penetrate. It's interesting how many mysteries we can take when we read a poem. Mysteries are small in the poems. They are a few words that we cannot understand. Will we abandon understanding and go to sleep at that point? We pass over some of these things. You don't know what the 4 shades of white perhaps are, and you wonder about this. You pull back into the truce you've made with yourself. Is that a criticism of the person who's parting, or just an acquiescence to that? But what really carries this on is a remarkable syntactical plays and works and images. There is, for instance, this pointer doesn't work. I have the other, no, the other one is fine. Don't worry, it's my pointer that doesn't work. There is this remarkable, where my heart under skin is. The placement of the is a very interesting, and it creates the tension in that, and it makes that remarkable. And then hive and ivory, very interesting. And then at the end, there is this absolutely incredible syntactical sentence, whose are you in that intense and separate ache, if not mine? It's a wonderful love poem. Something very different. We're back in Ithaca. Here is Archie Ammons, a natural philosopher, my guru in poetry, and here he's having just fun. But it's interesting to examine how he does these things. The spiral rag. Opposites attracting could easing jar to a standstill, or unmoderated blast into mutual annihilations. Oh, or just at the meeting node veer around each other, the momentum transforming into spin, which would of course generate a whirlpool flow through so that the energies undemolished and still current could find a place where, slowed, they could give up their terrible shapes and tendencies and dissipate into the continuum from which they might eventually return. Anyway, the circle won't do except as an infinitely extensible outer boundary. Also, the sphere won't do for some reason I've forgotten, no transfusing discharge, just surface extension with only surface flow. But the vortex will come close to doing because it gives a standing motion shape at the central interior so that high formations finding each other have a way to go, the truest motions, truest shapes, the spiral's inward arc, the inward turning world that promotes a direction for the meeting that can wear down or fly apart somewhere past the tightening screws world, whatever. What a mechanism for averting, for taking in, changing, and giving out, for holding still while the motion flies. The mind figures, but even though it wants to do well, never comes up with a source of what it comes up with. Okay, it sounds like someone's rambling here, and it's very hard to get away with, in poems, with phrases as you see here, like for some reason I've forgotten. That's not a usual poetic phrase. Okay, but what he's talking about is spirals, and he's got the essence of a spiral. The essence of a spiral is that it is a motion transfer device. That is, it's a device for transporting matter that whirl, whether it's in black holes or elsewhere. And he accomplishes that. I think he makes us read faster or slower by the words that are there. And it's interesting to see how he accomplishes that. For instance, he wants to slow us down. So one of the things you're taught in poetry courses is not to leave articles at the end of a line. The reason is that the article belongs with the thing that comes after, okay? So you want to see it together. So an article at the end of a stanza is really a flag. And that slows me down. But then it has a place where comma, slowed, comma. That's the slowest slow I know. 2 commas and a slow really gets me down. The other thing that's done here is Archie is, like Joanna, is a real master of walking the tight edge of syntax. So let's see. The truest motions, truest shapes, the spiral's inward arc. So English was my sixth language. English is a strange language, and possessives in English got a problem because also the abbreviations in this kind of colloquial poem, it could be for is, but it's not. The thing with possessives is we're naturally curious. When we say the Emil's something, you want to know what it is that Emil is possessing, okay? So when you say the truest motions, you expect the next word to be what is being possessed by the motion. No, truest shapes. Still not given away. The spirals, eventually you get it there. But what he's doing here is making us read faster in order to get to what is being possessed. This is it's a device, it's natural for Archie. I'm sure I can tell you because I've watched them, there are very few drafts in what he does. That's the end of my second story. Now let's look at some portraits. So portraits are interesting in a number of ways. They're representations. Are they not realistic, naturalistic? One interesting thing is we tend to associate naturalistic or realistic portraits in Western art with the Italian Renaissance. But I wanted just to show you these because these are the Fayum mummy cases. These are Hellenistic, a mixture of Greek and Egyptian art from around a period of Christ to about 300. And they are remarkable renderings, some not so sophisticated, but some quite remarkable of realistic representation. We come to the Renaissance, and here we have Piero della Francesca's portrait of Federico da Montefeltro, which hangs in the Uffizi. This is a typical Renaissance portrait with a little landscape in the background. Federico's portrayed here. There is a contract between the painter, and he's going to be portrayed reasonably realistic. He's also being portrayed for certain purposes. This is going to hang in a town hall. It is not a portrait to be given to his little daughter. But knowing what we know about Montefeltro, it may be the same. He is not a man I would like to meet in a business deal or on a battlefield. He's obviously a very serious guy. Here is some hundreds of miles to the north, Albrecht Dürer painting a portrait of his father, also a very serious image. Not all the images were necessarily that way, but portraits changed. There is a world of difference between what you see here, not in craftsmanship, but in expression, and this Rembrandt portrait of his wife, Saskia. And you see here, but there is something interesting about how it's accomplished. The feeling you get is that the light is coming from the person, rather than the light is illuminating the person. And that is the mastery of Rembrandt. Here is the greatest, I don't know if we can kill the lights a little bit more on a stage. Can we lower the lights a little bit? Okay, this is the greatest representation of representation ever painted. This is Velázquez Las Meninas. Has been cleaned just a few years ago. It's worth seeing in a Prado in Madrid. A great court portrait that Velázquez was commissioned to make of the Infanta here. It's remarkable. There is this life-size portrait, which is this portrait, being painted by Velázquez. And while he's painting it, all these people are facing forward. Why are they facing forward? It is because their Catholic majesties have just come into the room, perhaps, and you can see their reflections in the mirror in back there. And the ladies in waiting, which give this the name, a dwarf, a dog as usual, this remarkable figure in back, which renders great length, a great visual perceptive depth to this painting in the background. Interesting in Velázquez tried all the time to think of himself as more of a courtier than as a painter, a craftsman. And one mark of this is here. 17 years after the portrait was painted, he was inducted into the Order of Santiago, which is sort of like the Order of the Garter, some honor. He went back and painted in the insignia of the Order of Santiago on his breast so that everyone would know that that's where he belonged. But what I really want to focus in on here is something else. I want to focus in on a princess. And she looks like a girl trapped in a corset. And that was it was the standard wear, even for little girls. Terrible time in that time. But she looks like a rather stiff little girl. But if we go in close on her, here like this, and I will go in closer. This is about as close as I dare to get. I can see the paint strokes now at this point. At this point, what we see is a little girl. This is a Renoir girl trapped in a Velázquez portrait. Here she is, closer still. Amazing. That portrait, people say there are no footnotes in art, like in science. Well, that portrait has served as a reference point for many others. I've collected about 20 images where it was used. This is Peter Wade, an English artist, with socialist leanings at a certain time. So he paints a picture of Lenin, an iconic picture of Lenin, and Lenin has got his face. The room is entirely cleared, but Lenin's face is exactly where the king and queen were in their face. Here is a subversive image, which I better remove before the senior senator from Montana gets in trouble. And this is Joel Peter Witkin copying this. This is Picasso, late in life, does 58 paintings based on the Las Meninas. You can see them in the Sert Museum in Barcelona. Consistent with Picasso's psychological outlook, the person who grows largest here is the artist, Velázquez. And here is a footnote on a footnote. This is a Brazilian painter painting a picture of Picasso painting one of his portraits over there. This is the ultimate achievement, and that is to be used as a Google image. I'm still waiting for that. So this is, but I have made it to be a clue in a Times crossword puzzle. That was I have put that on my CV. Portraits evolved with time. The expression became more important. This is Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, German expressionist, and you can see that the feeling of the person in the portrait, it doesn't matter that it is realistic. It's the essence that is conveyed in this. So what are portraits? Portraits are much more complicated than we think they are. Portraits are a complicated tripartite transaction between the person being painted, the sitter, the artist, and us and then there are 10,000 onlookers who have shaped our feelings today about how we should feel about that. When I say that Federico da Montefeltro is dour-looking, and that that is a culturally conditioned statement to a certain extent. The transaction is very complicated. The artist was more of a crafts person at the time of Piero della Francesca than he was by the time of Kirchner. There is a transformation in which Velázquez is a point, but there was a transformation. Then the 10,000 other people, what right does the artist have to, on the basis of a few hours sitting, to capture the personality of the person? And yet they do in the best portraits. And you can feel it when you see the portrait. Interesting. And then we come 1,000 years later or more and say that this is such and such. Very complicated transaction really takes place. Let me show you as quickly as I can for something I like, something totally different, and that is some Japanese ceramics. So it happens to be something which I like. And this Japanese culture, ceramics played a special role, in part due to ceramics are a constant of human civilization. Wherever there are human beings, there are shards, pieces of pots. There have been some for 30,000 years with us. But in Japan, they played a special role. In part, it is a special aesthetic achievement. In part, this is a consequence of the Chinese and Korean influences on Japanese culture. In part, it's an aesthetic tone of great sophistication which came from associating set Buddhist and native influences, culminating in the remarkable tea ceremony, so that the concentration and purity of every object that's associated with the tea ceremony is just unmatched. I show you two classic bowls. Here is one by Koetsu. This is in the period, he worked in the period 1558 to 1637. It's a very rough, here is two other images of it. This does not convey is there is a little mauve to brown shading on the two bands in the middle in this image. Quite a remarkable rough object, a tea bowl. 50 years later, Ogata Kenzan, who was the brother of the great maker of Japanese screens, Ogata Korin, makes this bowl, and you see, it's not a perfect circle on top. It's rough also in some ways, but you see here the decorative element which distinguishes this from other objects, for instance, from Chinese objects of this period. There has been a continued tradition of Japanese ceramics throughout the ages, continues to this day. The interesting thing about Japan is not that they can make cars and CD players better than we can. It's that they can do so while maintaining their traditional arts. You only have to see this if you go to Japan by visiting that pinnacle of Japanese culture, a department store. And you'll see in every Japanese department store, there is a floor dedicated to ceramics and scrolls and things like that. These are some things from Cornell's collection. Tagaki Shin, a contemporary artist. Here is a close-up of this, the cranes flying here. This is done by a resist technique where the artist blows, puts the cranes a cutout and then blows some pigment onto the ceramic at this point, and to get that particular pattern. Very important in Japanese art, and this is a big difference from European art until the 20th century, and that is what I would call giving the aleatory its due. That is giving a place for chance. I can assure you, because I've worked with Japanese potters, that these objects that you see here, which have a certain perfection, that they are part of an interaction of the artist and the kiln, the oven where it's baked, and how the things are stacked in it, and what plants are put in there, if it is that kind of a firing. This is Furukawa Takahisa, a bowl with surprises. What this doesn't convey is that the areas down here are just exposed ceramic and very rough. And there is not only this decorative element, but there is a play between the roughness and the smoothness of this. And you look inside the bowl, and there are these dragonflies flying around, and some scattered, maybe pine needles. It is a seasonal bowl, very typical Japanese. Again, the roughness and the smoothness, this conveyed only by a little bit by the reflections. Here is a contemporary, all of these people are living. Morino Hiroaki in Kyoto, who makes remarkable abstract vases in unusual glazes. And Miyashita Zenji, this is a very strong object. This one it's about half the size of what you see on the screen. It's large and it's powerful, but it also is very delicate. Each of these layers is of pigmented clay that you see here overlain to give a kind of landscape, is about 0.5 millimeter thick, and yet it doesn't flake off. So it's actually a remarkable technical achievement in the firing to make this particular bowl. And you have your own here. And the reason I chose Beth Lowe's work is because I wanted to get out of the abstraction of the Japanese art form, though there were decorative elements in it. And I wanted to make the point that ceramics can be figurative or funny in some way. So these are two things which have been made by one of your art department people who is a great ceramicist. Now we have come to the end of the 3 stories. So why I put these up just as symbols of science and art. Blake's poem, Tiger, Tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? But what do they have in common? So I'll tell you what I see in common in the things and then I'll tell you about differences. So the one part of the shared ground, a very important one, especially for scientists, is that we are sharing in creation. So, yes, the natural is beautiful, and I'll show you a photograph in a while, but the works of art that you have seen, the poems that we value, the science we have created, those are human, man and woman made, artifactual, synthetic, unnatural. Sculpture does not grow on trees. Okay. Now, that connection is important in a world where scientists are often marked as the producers of the unnatural. Of course, I climbed up in that series of characterizations a ladder toward slightly more negative associations with each word as I went from human-made to unnatural. But it's very important in a dialogue between art and science that we recognize that we are all in the business of transforming what has been given to us. And we create things. Now, the second part of this equation is whatever we create must have an ethical judgment attached to it. At the very least, that it not hurt or have the potential of hurting people. Now, you might say, artists sometimes take a romantic view. How can I hurt somebody? Well, my God, I've seen poems about former lovers that are very hurtful. And novelists think they can get away with anything because it's fiction, quote unquote. And they put in portraits of all their best friends in the most unflattering poses. So it's not so simple even for artists, but here's where scientists need to do a little more, is to think about the ethical consequences of what they do, and to think about it at the outset at creation. Okay, craftsmanship. So this is a good way to, this is what they share, is a regard for craftsmanship. Here's a statement from Bill Reed, Haida artist in Canada, and you can read it. And his recognition of the quality of being well made applies as much to the old canoe here as it does to the paddles, which are actually Bill Reed's paintings of these things. He's a designer of jewelry. He's a very multifaceted artist. You know, you can fool some people some of the time. But in the long run, craftsmanship tells. And good attention to craftsmanship is part of what goes on in, for instance, in research group meetings in a scientific setting where you tell each other that this paper is maybe not quite right or there's something they should have done. It's those questions of craftsmanship that are very important. They're very important to artists when they look at each other's work. It's important, the craftsmanship, to a scientist. When one makes a molecule, this is a valuable component of a chemotherapy regime, Taxol, paclitaxel, which came originally from the bark of a yew tree, but you could produce about 3 doses from the bark of a 300-year-old yew tree, and you killed the tree in the process. That was not going to be made available until one could make it synthetically, and that was done by Robert Holton at Florida State at a given time in a competition with another group. It was made. The craftsmanship was immensely high in this process. There is something in the work of the best artists and of science that has to do with an economy of statement. You know, the poems are perhaps the best illustration of this. But what's interesting about poems, what was interesting about the words that were used by the poet in those syntactically difficult phrases that nevertheless had power, there were just 3 or 4 words. And they meant much more than those words mean literally. That is the power of a poem, that it has on you. That economy of statement and intensity is there in some of the best science. It's not there to be looked for. It's not to be looked for in a typical scientific paper like those three that I showed you. Those are they're interesting in their own way. The German one was the most important one. Our theoretical one and the structure were less important. But the best papers have some sort of intensity which carries emotion in it. And that is what I mean by economy of statement. This is where symmetry actually plays a role. So when you can use symmetry in science to delineate that something cannot possibly happen or that something should happen, that is a very concise way of saying things. Both science and art are consumed by a desire to communicate. That should have been obvious from those articles I cited to you. There was no way that exchange could go on without those articles or without my sending the preprint. But it's there in the poems as well. Now, I know some poets who will tell me they are writing for the drawer. They don't care if anyone reads but my experience is if you scratch them just a little, they'll read everything they've got for you. I accept it in totalitarian countries, but there is a difference between therapy and poetry. Poetry is for other people. I read those poems to you because someone has written them and published them. And the internet is changing things in a very different and interesting way here. But the communication is there, the desire to communicate. This is a difficult one. I believe that the acts of creation accomplished with craftsmanship, with an economy of statement, are cross-cultural. Now here I run into a prevalent multiculturalism in some of our thinking. That is, could I be building in cultural biases in my thinking of what will this mean to a Native American or to an African? And I understand that, and I also, what showed it up also was, remember that translation of a German poem that I said, Robert Bly? Rilke used the word candelabra. And Bly translated it by gas lamp. Not too great. But what's in there is first that Bly felt that he needed to translate that poem. That was a very important feeling. And that he tried to do so. And it's not important that he failed on a word, or if he failed on that word. And if that word presents problems, if the best poems are just, if not treason, then at least not correct translation, I think one has to try. One has to try even to translate the poems. And I think that the poems carry an import across culture. I think that there is a mixture in human being of the selfish and the altruistic. We do things to be praised. We write poems to be praised by others, to communicate with others, to please dead or absent parents. All kinds of things go on in the act. But I think at the same time, there's also a deep-set desire to share with others what we have found. And this is especially true when we try to reach out for the new, because the new is what was not there before. And whether it's in words or in a painting or in a molecule. We lack the words to describe it. We want to show it to other people. Maybe they can use it. Maybe they can find the words to describe it. I think we share, that art and science share the elements of a common aesthetic. Now that's a elevated phrase, so let me explain what I mean. Here are some molecules that I don't have to tell you look beautiful. They are shaped like platonic solids, polyhedra of carbons with a hydrogen radiating out, and then at lower right, a molecule that should be on a flag of Brazil, the Buckminster fullerene. And these molecules are simply beautiful and beautifully simple, and the moment I show them to you, I feel guilty. The reason I feel guilty is because I know there are other molecules that didn't have a beeline into my soul, maybe into yours. So this is hemoglobin, the oxygen carrier in our blood, 9,500 atoms, 4,500 hydrogens, 2,500 carbons, 700 oxygens, about equal number of nitrogens, 12 sulfurs, 4 irons, and it looks, even in a simplified form where you throw away all the hydrogens, it still looks like a clump of pasta congealed from primordial soup, a tapeworm quadrille. It doesn't look like it's simple. So that's why we have trouble admiring it. And that's part, so this is complexity at work. And chemistry moves between those two poles. Here is the same aesthetic played out for buildings. Here is a high point of Islamic architecture in Mughal India, in Agra, the Taj Mahal, a memorial monument where the bilateral symmetry is incredibly striking and beautiful. And here is the Transparente in Toledo Cathedral. I'm going to focus in on that space at the top, which is one of my favorite spaces. There's a penetration from this church into some other nave, and in there are sculptures which are covering the whole area. This is the Baroque. If any line can be made curved, it will be. This is all about complexifying, and yet it also reaches for our soul. And is nature symmetrical? Does nature look like Buckminster fullerene? Or does it look more like hemoglobin? Well, here's a landscape that you are able to enjoy, except that the glacier is receding. And it is never symmetrical. And what is pleasing about it is it's never symmetrical. So where does beauty reside? Does it reside in a symmetry? Does it reside in a chaos, a complexity? No, it resides at some tense edge where symmetry and asymmetry, where order and disorder contend for each other in our mind. An example, this is in Park Güell in Barcelona. Antonio Gaudi builds this. There's a plain ground, earth covered on the right. There's a fall off here. There's a set of benches here. That's what these are. And you see here, there's no way Gaudi would make that a straight line. Curved lines are inherently more interesting than straight lines, despite scientists' attempts to fit straight lines to everything in the world. Curved lines are fun, but what symmetry sets is a repose, a set of foundation, an order psychologically. And then, is there any way he was going to make the mosaics be black diamonds and white diamonds alternating? That would be so boring. He makes what he does, and he makes us wonder, why did he not fill these, and why did he fill these? That's part of what makes this object interesting in some way and beautiful. And ultimately, they're filled with a desire to understand this world, to understand this beautiful and terrible world. But there are differences. So let's talk a little about differences. So, ambiguity is an interesting one. Until scientists in the late 19th century learned how to define heat, work, and energy carefully and exactly, they could never figure out why those beautiful gleaming steam engines in the Midlands, the products of 19th century English construction, could never get more than 25% efficiency on the conversion of the heat into power. And so it took unambiguous definitions to define that. And for a large part of science, it works that way, that you need careful definitions. But you know that a word in a poem means two things, and that it sounds like 7 other words. That's what makes life interesting. And in a poem, I forgot to point it out, of Joanna's, there are several places where she plays with that in a number of ways. So ambiguity has a role. Interesting chemistry, though chemists believe that they're doing real science, and they are, but a lot of things in chemistry, I believe, that's another lecture, are actually productive in terms of research and experiments because the definitions are fuzzy and not so precisely made. But that is another story. Solutions versus resolutions. So this is a box that science has boxed itself in, that it is concerned with a set of problems which have solutions. Even when you have Gödel's theorem, that some things are inconsistent, cannot have absolute clarity. And our friends in the humanities know very well that there are many problems in this world for which there are no solutions, but there are resolutions. You can write, there have been written 10 million poems about the end of love. And the 10 millionth and first poem still has validity if it's a good poem. And you can have an idea if it's a good poem or not. So it's not going to be resolved. And this sometimes leads to a little bit of a derogatory attitude by scientists toward humanists. Infinitely paraphrasable universals versus singular particulars. Boy, that's long words here. Let me see what I mean. So, science ideally, you want to have E equals mc squared valid for any m and for any e. The c is fixed. And if you have a plan for making an aspirin factory, it should work when you construct it in Brazil or in Mongolia. It's the same kind of process. It should work in practice. You need the chemical engineers to make it work because there always are problems. But that's what I mean by infinitely paraphrasable universals. It's somehow whereas what singular particulars is what poetry is about. And I picked a poem actually for this by Greg Pape. It's a piece of a poem of his describing a landscape. Crack of rock on rock comes down the canyon, the light blush on a heart fades then fires. Up the slope and over the scree, the bird of his gaze goes and lights on a bear digging at the base of a boulder. The bear rocks the boulder from side to side, gives it a shove from the top, offers it up to gravity as the sun rises and shines in the eyes of the bear, who looks down on what? A feast of larvae, ants, worms exposed in a damp earth or an empty hole that attests to hunger. Along the creek, mist and shadow linger. When he looks again, the bear is gone. He goes on walking, turning things over in the early light. You know, it's that bear, and it's that scree, and in them is the world. That is the power of the poem. And that's what I mean by particulars expressed in this. But in the end, there are similarities. It's not that the similarities outweigh the commonalities, the differences. I take them both. There are others that you can think of. I don't mean to make you think the way that I think about these things necessarily. But I want to show you one thing, and this is an address to the young people in the audience, who sometimes are, whatever the masterworks that you see, a poem, a great poem about the power of the tiger, and maybe other things. The periodic table, when you see these masterpieces, I know the feeling that I had. I wanted to create something, of course, but I was intimidated by the masterpieces. So my message to the young people is, please do not look at the masterpieces. Look at what went before them. This is Mendeleev's draft of the periodic table. He told a story. He told a good story about writing the weights of the elements on the cards and laying them out and shuffling them to get in order. No one has found the cards. The cards may have existed, they may have not. He told the story 100 times. It was a good story. I know the experience. This is what is in his notebooks. He makes a list of the elements as you would to fit them in with their atomic weights. And as he fits, this is a shopping list at the bottom. And he crosses them out as he fits them in. There are 3 elements that don't fit in the first time around. He's writing in a mixture of German and Russian because he worked in Germany. It's in the lifeblood of theoreticians. That's what Mendeleev was here. In the lifeblood of theoreticians to make things fit in that don't fit in. He makes them fit in. You can see the periodic table minus a group. All you have to do is to rotate it around. This is the last draft of Blake's poem. It's the printer's mark across it, that slash from top to bottom. This is in the Bodleian Library. And here he had a phrase, dare, grasp. And it didn't fit in here. He knew that this word, dread, grasp, this was 2 strong Anglo-Saxon words. Anglo-Saxon words are what poets like. They are strong. And so you want to fit them in. So he tried them. It didn't fit in there, so he tried them over here. They didn't fit in there. He got them in here somewhere. It was a salvage job. This is a remarkable document, and I think when you see this, I don't have to tell you what is the most beautiful thing about these. What is the prima facie evidence that these are acts of human creation and not made by machines? It's the crossing out. Now we come to the end of the story, and I think there is only one culture. For me, there is. What unites us is that we seek to understand the world around us. And it's not surprising that the search for understanding take different forms. And certainly not astonishing that we, being human, should think that the degree and nature of understanding that we achieve is superior to that of others. But these are just weaknesses. God knows that this last century in which I was born and that we are living in now, and every day of our life lend us evidence of these faults of human beings. But there is a time to praise, and I'm paraphrasing actually Rilke on another occasion. There is a time to praise the achievements of the human mind, creation that is accomplished with craftsmanship, concisely communicated in a way that cuts across cultures and serves others and pleases oneself, and with a feeling for beauty, and always, always trying to understand. This is the one culture we need to preserve. Thank you.
Professor Hoffman will be happy to answer any questions. There should be some microphones in the aisle.
And you can take all the pictures you want, and you should buy some books outside. I got it from my mother when I decided not to become a real doctor, okay? And then when I told her that she was a great lady, saved us during the war. When I told her that I started writing poetry, I got it all over again. She said, "They're going to fire you." And so I want you to prove my mother wrong. It's much easier to make a living as a chemist than as a poet. Yes, please. There's one coming here.
Well, since my father's not here, I feel like someone has to represent the family. I really appreciated the breadth and the simplicity and the depth all in that. The one thing that I'd be curious, have you explored then the relationship between that cultural view of such basic human expression and interest and all, is any relationship with religion?
Well, I'm one of these atheists who has a respect for religion. I'm a confirmed atheist, as they can come, but who has a respect for religion and who also tries, I think, understands how religious people think. And I wrote a book with Shira Leibowitz-Schmidt, an observant Jewish woman, about issues of science and Jewish religious tradition. The book has sunk into oblivion because if you write a book saying that the Bible tells you where to find riches and gold, you can publish it, or that it has a code to the universe. If you write a book that says the Bible is pernicious nonsense, you can publish that. But it's hard to get something in between. I think that a part of being human and of human consciousness is a seeking for something greater than ourselves and other than ourselves, and yet something that we share in. So I would call it the spiritual. Now, it is reached for many people The spiritual is, I believe, not to be used to teach ethics. One of the arguments sometimes for religious systems. But I think it is part of the human condition, and it is for many human beings to be found in what we call religion. But also it is found for me and for other people in music or in poetry, as you see here. There was something spiritual about having the time this morning, Richard, thanks, to be able to go through the work of some of the poets on your faculty, in as much as I could find it on the internet, and to read some of those poems, and it was hard to make a choice for what to put in. And that spiritual is very important to me, and I think it's important to people. And I think that a good bit of the complex of ideas of what makes art valuable and good science valuable has a spiritual content to it.
This was a very fun lecture and very enlightening, and thank you very much. I thought of the words from a Stevie Wonder song. I'd like you to comment on his words, if you would. He said, "You believe in things you don't understand, and you suffer." But then in the same song, he says, "Do all that you can." Would you comment on his words, please? You believe in things you don't understand, and you suffer.
Yes, sometimes I feel that way. I think the last part that was interesting to me was, but you do the best that you can, and that I think I heard you say. So I think as human beings, now we're shading over to ethics. We're not going to cover all of philosophy tonight. But as human beings, we aspire to things. We know what things are good, what things serve others. And we realize we cannot live up to them in a daily fashion. We fail at some point or another. And for some, that failure turns into depression and other things. But I think that the important thing is to aspire to things. And to try to do the best that we can at any time, whether it is with respect to our children or spouses or students or other colleagues. Just try. I think that is important. Now, there is an interesting thing that I take off from yours, from that statement, and that is that the sublime, that which is more than beautiful, can be painful. And that was an idea that in one of the classic statements on the sublime by Burke was a central point, that it's so beautiful that it hurts. And that is and Rilke has a poem, I cannot quote it, about, shall I not reach for the angels, even as I know it'll destroy me? And there's something of that in there. I think we try to do the best we can.
All right, I've got a question. So I'm a person who comes from both, I have a science and an art background, specifically music. And I can understand how both sides see the world in so very different ways, but you've convinced me to some degree tonight that we kind of see in a similar way. So my question to you is, how do we break down the barriers between the artistic world and the scientific world? Because scientists would benefit so much from thinking in an artistic way, specifically with like the organic molecules and stuff. So what are your thoughts?
Yes, so you noticed I had no musical examples. I was bad. Music means a lot to me, and I have very broad musical tastes. Almost anything live goes. We certainly would benefit from, we have a number of problems in science, some of which I've written about. In general, we have, with a Cartesian tradition in science, which values that which can be reduced to mathematics or formulas. So it's a physics-based tradition, the mathematics, though it's interesting to look at physicists' attitudes toward pure mathematics. But with that tradition, we tend to downgrade the motivating forces for creativity, for coming up with new ideas in science, which are not reducible to mathematics. And the two which I've written about is, one is metaphor, so that it's obvious that the thing there, for instance, is the idea of a landscape of climbing a hill and then going down. That idea is not just in chemistry of a reaction profile, but it's in many other sciences. A very important, now what it is a metaphor. And metaphors are mappings from one point, or I'm using metaphor for generically for things some people would call similes to, but it's a mapping from one part of experience to another one. Unless you recognize that it is a metaphor and that it may have a limited range of validity, you may not see where it can get you into trouble. The other thing which scientists don't realize, I think, I don't mean to preach too much here in a negative way, because I see the positive in things, scientists sometimes don't realize that they're telling a story, that they're engaged in narrative, and that in doing so, they share a tradition which is as old as humanity of telling stories, and that they have something to learn from people outside of science. First of all, about the art of telling stories, well, but also about what goes on in storytelling. But you can see this next time you go to a scientific seminar. Watch the speaker. What they're sketching, generally, 90% of the time, is a classic heroic narrative. And they never do that in a paper exactly the same way. But they relax a little in a seminar, and then what they tell is what they set out to do. They may tell you why, or not so much about why, but they set out what to do, and along the way there are obstacles. There are the beasts that Odysseus faced as he's going through this. And there are delays and there are dead ends. But you can be dead sure that they're going to overcome those. They're going to kill the beasts and climb the mountain. And then they've got a problem. Because the problem is, once I've climbed, that's the problem of all heroes, Hercules included. What do you do after you're done with the end of your life, and with the rest of your life? So if they've built up the narrative too strongly, then it's not clear at the end. Watch for those things. Those things there are in classic descriptions of fairy tales, in all kinds of compendia of how narratives are done. It's useful that we know that. Storytelling is old, storytelling is important. It satisfies the mind, it pleases the mind. It's wonderful. I've told you a story. Stories.
When you're confronting a challenging problem, whether it's scientific or poetic, how do you solve it?
A challenging problem. So I think about it for a while, but what I just go ahead and do something. I put hands to paper. I put pen to paper in the days. I actually still write a few letters each day by pen. So it's, I just try to do something, and the very act of doing something then precipitates somehow the next action and some involvement with the problem. So it's a very... Now, there is another thing behind your question, is how does one deal with challenges, how does one deal with things that look like you can't do them, problems that face you. So the things is like the standard advice for dealing with mild depression, and that is you concoct a series of small tasks that are doable. And by God, in what I do daily life, I have them. I have to read the paper here, have to write this, and so on. Small tasks that carry some satisfaction. And the other thing is to stop thinking about yourself not being able to do that problem, do something for someone else. So go out and help someone with some problem. And usually that helps you with your own problem, somehow. And then some bicycling helps too. Thank you all for coming.